Sarah. Are you under arrest on suspicion of murder at Sadie Hartley?
Before we begin, I need to give you a serious content warning. This case involves the brutal murder of an innocent woman by two jealous, obsessed killers. We'll be discussing extreme violence, stalking, and shocking incompetence. The details are disturbing. If you need to step away at any point, please do. Your well-being comes first. This is the case of Sadie Hartley. This is Sarah Williams, and this is Katrina Walsh. If there was ever a pair of criminal masterminds who managed to be both terrifying and utterly pathetic, it's these two. Sarah and Katrina fancied themselves like characters out of a crime thriller. They had burner phones, GPS trackers, disguises, a diary so detailed it could have doubled as their own confession. They plotted what they proudly called the perfect murder. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Their victim was 60-year-old Sadie Hartley, a kind, successful woman whose only mistake was falling in love with a man who had once dated one of them. And for that, she was hunted, stalked, and brutally murdered by two jealous fantasists who couldn't even tell the difference between real life and bad fiction. What followed was a crime so senseless, so needless, and so astonishingly incompetent that even detectives described it as part tragedy, part absurdity. Welcome to Helmshore, Lancashire, where the hills are gentle. The tea is strong, and these two masterminds redefined the word stupid. This is the story of Sadie Hartley, and the two women who thought they could get away with murder. Welcome to Helmshore. Folks, nestled in the Rossendale Valley of Lancashire, this village is known as a quiet, affluent pocket of England, the kind of place where crime feels more like an outsider's worry than an insider's issue. It's the kind of place where old textile mills sit as relics of the past. Rolling hills surround you on the horizon, and the evenings fall into quietness long before the pubs close their doors. With tranquility like this, Helmshore probably feels just right over the long summer days. But winters, that's a different story. The month was January 2016, and winter was fully underway. Much like the rest of England, Helmshore's streets were quite deserted. Most residents were probably trying to keep warm and comfortable indoors, and with so much coziness around the town, it was quite hard to imagine that in just a moment, something terrible was about to unfold. Found on the southern edge of the village, Sunnybank Road was everything you'd expect from a charming English village home. Well kept, welcoming, valued at a staggering £500,000. Quite frankly, it was beautiful. Perfect for anyone aiming for this kind of cozy lifestyle. Inside this property lived 60-year-old Sadie Hartley. Let me tell you about Sadie Hartley, because before she became a headline, before she became a victim, she was a real person with a real life. Born in 1955, Sadie grew up in England. Friends and family remember her as caring, gentle, and full of life. By the time she reached 60 years old, she had built a loving family and a thriving career. Sadie co-founded her own company, Hartley Taylor Medical Communications, alongside her best friend, Julie Taylor. She was passionate about medical science, dedicated her professional life to organizing conferences and projects aimed at improving treatments in intensive care medicine. She was keen on fighting some of the toughest diseases in hematology and infection. Julie would later recall that Sadie could hardly ever stay away from work, even just after her children were born. That's because this was just who she was. Passionate, tireless, always trying to balance her ambition. To be honest with you, yeah, I can relate. Us workaholics are just built differently. By 2016, her children, Charlotte and Harry, had grown up and moved out. Although they no longer lived in the village, they stayed incredibly close with their mom. In fact, it was only one day before Sadie's murder that Charlotte phoned her mom with extremely exciting news. She had just gotten engaged. Sadie was ecstatic for her daughter, immediately started sharing ideas for the wedding. She was thrilled at the thought of all the celebrations ahead. Tragically, she would never get to experience them. Back at home in Helmshore, Sadie lived with her long-term partner, Ian Johnston. a 57-year-old retired firefighter, a few years younger than her. Together, they led a comfortable life in her beautiful home. They were known as a warm and steady couple, settling into their golden years. Ian would later describe their relationship as cozy and kind, filled with quiet evenings, gentle laughter, and simple, happy love. But what Sadie could never have known was that long, dark shadows from Ian's past were slowly creeping into her life. Shadows that would soon tear apart everything she had worked so hard to build. This is the part where I have to tell you about Ian and his terrible decision-making. Ian has a certain history that Sadie only partially knew about, and it would come back to haunt both of them in the most catastrophic way. A few years before moving in with Sadie, Ian unexpectedly crossed paths with a much younger woman named Sarah Williams. Their first encounter was actually quite comical. They accidentally bumped into each other at an indoor ski slope. Ian was teaching part-time lessons. Sarah was a travel agent. Apparently their chemistry was immediate. Ian would later admit that in a profound lack of judgment, he invited Sarah back to his home shortly after meeting her. Sarah arrived in a mini skirt and high heels. Now, while all of this was going on, Ian was already seeing Sadie. Although the relationship was long distance, it was very real. Deep down, Ian knew this was not innocent. And as you can probably tell where this is going, the consequences would be cataclysmic. For Sarah Williams, seducing Ian was hardly unusual. Those who knew her would later call her a serial mistress. Personally, I think she just saw monogamy as an allergy. By her mid-30s, Sarah had already spent more than half her life as the secret side piece of wealthy businessmen, usually over 40 years her age. This included an affair with a 60-year-old millionaire that started when Sarah was only 17 years old. That affair lasted for nearly 2 entire decades. Mr. Hardwick was her indulgent sugar daddy, gave her a credit card, a £320 weekly allowance, took her on luxury holidays around the world more than a dozen times a year. To Mr. Hardwick, Sarah was a glamorous escape. To Sarah, he was nothing more than financial security. Remarkably, despite this going on for almost 20 years, his wife had no idea. But even with this arrangement, Sarah still sought other thrills. And that's when she found Ian Johnston. The affair with Ian burned hot, but briefly. By late 2013, Ian was becoming deeply uncomfortable. He realized he was in love with Sadie. He admitted to himself that cheating was a grave mistake. Ian wanted to end it, but Sarah had other plans. Sarah had become increasingly possessive, dramatic, difficult. By October 2014, about 2 years after it all began, Ian finally cut off the affair, but Sarah had no intention of being cast aside. She became obsessed with him instead, and this obsession would extend past Ian, too. In her mind, Sadie was the obstacle standing between her and the man she considered perfect. If Sarah couldn't have Ian, nobody could. Sarah's response was immediate. Within a few days of Ian ending things, Sadie received an anonymous letter in the post. Inside that letter were the grim details of Ian's affair. The letter was laced with threats and insults. Sarah even claimed Ian hadn't bothered to change the bedsheets after sleeping with her. Ian was forced to confess. Actually, forced is probably an understatement. He had been caught with his pants down. His relationship with Sadie nearly collapsed. But ultimately, Sadie chose to forgive him. Ian promised it would never happen again. Despite the betrayal, Sadie's love persevered. The two even decided to strengthen their relationship. Ian moved into her home in Helmshore, determined to leave Sarah in the past. But rejection only fueled Sarah's obsession. She began pursuing Ian more relentlessly. Swinging between desperate pleading and seething anger, she sent him gifts, wrote him long messages, begged him to have sex with her. She stalked the places Ian frequented, trying to accidentally bump into him. On one occasion, Sarah went as far as breaking into his home while he was away, triggered the alarm system. Had police called to his property, Ian later admitted to friends and family that he felt stalked, that Sarah would not let him go. And yet, despite all of this, Ian made one fatal mistake that would always come back to haunt him. Ian never severed contact entirely. In moments of weakness, he sporadically exchanged flirty messages with her. Even after moving in with Sadie, this 1 foot in, 1 foot out behavior never gave either of them the space they needed to fully separate. For months, this back and forth continued. Only 10 days before the murder, on January 4th, 2016, Ian and Sarah exchanged more than 30 flirty messages in a single day. But what Ian saw as harmless flirting was actually escalating into something far darker. Sarah's fixation was about to tip into something prosecutors would later describe as delusional, unhinged, and deeply psychotic. By summer of 2014, only weeks after Ian ended the affair, Sarah confided in her close friend Katrina Walsh. Now, I'm not sure Sarah ever figured out how to make friends her own age, because Katrina was nearly double it. She was 56 years old. And just as unhinged, the two met through a local riding club. They bonded through riding, gossip, and eventually, violence. The comfort Katrina gave Sarah wasn't a glass of wine and a shoulder to cry on. It was affirmation of her sick fantasies. And neither of them were subtle about it, especially Katrina. To be clear here, I would never recommend murder. But if you are thinking about doing it, it's probably best that you don't record every detail in a diary. Alas. Katrina thought it was a smart idea. In one of her diary entries, Katrina wrote, "Sarah came around and we got caught up in endless murder plots for Ian's other half." What began as spiteful, wine-fueled fantasy would soon harden into something far more real. Sarah desperately wanted Sadie gone. And Katrina, whether out of loyalty, thrill-seeking, or sheer moral decay, was ready to help her friend. Together, they began to craft what they chillingly called the perfect murder. Over the next year and a half, the pair schemed over and over again. They were like stereotypical villains straight out of a bad movie. Katrina certainly looked the part. If there was one thing Katrina loved more than her horses, it was documenting every detail of her own downfall. Her diary became a step-by-step record of planning the murder. Meetings, supplies, darkest fantasies, all of it written down. They brainstormed multiple ways to kill Sadie, poisoning, staged accidents, even hiring a hitman. In mid-2015, Sarah floated the idea to Katrina's ex-husband. Kevin asked if he'd be interested in taking Sadie out for a price. Thankfully, Kevin had more sense than both of them. He immediately realized they had lost their minds. Not only did Kevin refuse to help, he also refused to ever meet them again. He warned Katrina that Sarah's ideas were dangerously criminal, suggested she should distance herself. Katrina did not take his advice. Instead, she poured herself a drink and wrote another entry that evening. It said Kev not going for the idea of being a hitman after all. Scuppering that idea. Plan B will be needed. I may get to be instrumental in helping remove that awful woman. Was so buzzing I needed a southern comfort to wind down. Katrina appeared to take depraved satisfaction in the thought of murdering an innocent woman. So without Kevin's help, Sarah and Katrina decided to do the dirty work themselves. And they would not be subtle about it. They began their official planning phase. Collection of tools and clothes. Rehearsing routines. Surveillance. Sarah already knew Ian's habits. But she wanted to map Sadie's. Was she home alone? Which doors were left unlocked? How predictable was her day-to-day? Around October 2015, the pair purchased a covert GPS tracker, slipped it beneath Ian's car. From that point forward, Sarah could watch the couple coming and going. The device would later hold 2 months' worth of travel history. And this wasn't the only creepy thing she did. Sadie and Ian attended the Chill Factory Ski Club Christmas dinner every year. On December 2nd, 2015, Sarah followed them to the party. While there, she discreetly positioned herself in the background of one of the group photos. In the foreground, Sadie and Ian smiled, completely oblivious that Sarah was right there behind them. Katrina and Sarah also bought binoculars to spy from afar, purchased burner phones for secret messages, wore strange disguises to blur their identities. When it came to vehicles, they didn't want Sarah's car on surveillance cameras, so they bought a cheap silver Renault Clio under a different name. For shoes, they ordered men's work boots, but 2 sizes larger, an effort to throw police off their trail if they left footprints. And since stun guns are illegal for civilians in the UK, they caught a ferry to Rotterdam, drove to Darmstadt in Germany, purchased a 500,000-volt device, then smuggled it back to the UK. Katrina was way too excited about their adventure. I'm actually surprised that between Sarah's ego and Katrina's diary, they didn't send police a calendar invite for the murder. By early January 2016, their murder kit was complete. Only one thing remained: timing. They decided to strike whenever Sadie would be alone, and fate offered a perfect window. In mid-January 2016, Ian had a planned trip to Switzerland, but even that caution wasn't enough. In classic amateur villain fashion, they tried a dry run. I'm not kidding, they quite literally planned a rehearsal. On January 7th, 2016, 1 week before the murder, Katrina walked up to Sadie's front door and pushed the doorbell. When Sadie answered, Katrina handed her a bunch of flowers. Not only was this highly perplexing for Sadie, but the flowers were cheap and rubbish. Definitely not a romantic gesture, more like an impulse buy at the checkout. Sadie was completely confused. She knew nothing about Katrina, had never seen her face before. Meanwhile, Katrina knew everything about her. Before Sadie could get a word out, Katrina was gone. An odd encounter, to say the least. We know through text messages sent in the following days that Sadie was concerned, but not too much. Personally speaking, I would probably think it's just some crackhead who got the wrong door. But unfortunately, the rehearsal worked. Now Sarah and Katrina knew that Sadie was willing to open the door to strangers. They put their fantasy into motion. January 14th, 2016, as Helmshore lay quiet beneath the winter chill, the streets were still, the air was sharp. Sadie had settled in for a peaceful night at home. Ian had already left several days prior for his ski trip. Sadie spent most of her day working, making calls, planning her daughter's engagement. But as daylight faded from the valley, Sarah and Katrina silently began their journey toward her. They arrived shortly after 7 in the evening, driving their throwaway vehicle into Sunnybank Road under the cover of darkness. Armed with an 8-inch kitchen knife and a 500,000-volt stun gun, Sarah was the designated attacker. Katrina stayed behind the wheel, acting as the lookout. The getaway driver, and arguably the world's most broken moral compass, Sadie's doorbell rang shortly after 8 in the evening. The moment that latch was unlocked, Sarah lunged forward and inside. Armed with the stun gun, Sarah pressed it against the side of Sadie's head and fired. 500,000 volts surged into her skull, sending Sadie to the floor. Although it didn't render her unconscious, it left her paralyzed and unable to move. From that moment, Sadie was entirely defenseless. What happened next can only be described as barbaric and frenzied. Sarah drew the kitchen knife and stabbed her dozens of times. Officers would later describe it as demonic savagery. Even in a semi-paralyzed state, it's clear that Sadie desperately tried to fight back. Her defensive wounds, found all over her hands and arms, confirmed this. But Sarah was absolutely relentless. In total, Sadie sustained more than 50 injuries across her body. Some blows were so ferocious they punctured her bones. In only a few minutes, Sadie lay there motionless. Sarah stood over her body, staring at the scene she had created. For a moment, she simply looked around. Then she straightened up, closed the front door behind her, and calmly walked away. Seconds later, Katrina arrived to pick her up. Just like that, the two drove off into the darkness. Sadie wasn't found until the following day. While driving away that night, Katrina and Sarah must have been running on pure adrenaline. But the strange thing is how calm they were afterwards. There was no panic, no fear, no rush to hide. We know this because afterwards, drove 1 hour to Sarah's home in Chester, changed their clothes, and watched a movie. Mamma mia! As if committing murder isn't hard enough to understand already. The sheer disconnection between murder and movie is honestly hard to comprehend. They really must have felt comfortable, but back in Helmshore, the first steps toward their downfall were already unfolding. At around noon the following day, a colleague of Sadie's made the grim discovery. The moment that front door opened gave way to absolute horror. The metallic tang of blood was heavy in the air. Sadie was lying face down in the hallway in her own blood. I can't even imagine finding a loved one like that. I don't think you'd ever return to your former self after witnessing such a thing. It was immediately clear this was no accident. Sadie had been murdered, to a horrifically vicious degree. Her friend wasted no time calling police. When officers arrived, even the most experienced of them were stunned. The violence Sadie had endured was absolutely staggering. In total, she had suffered more than 50 separate wounds across her face, neck, torso, and limbs. The scene was later described as an orgy of demonic savagery, which, to be honest with you, is quite a strange choice of words. However, it did make good headlines across the country. There was no doubt that Sadie's killers desperately needed to be found. Officers got to work quickly. While combing the scene, they found one crucial piece of evidence. Upon taking a closer look at her clothing, they found a single small barb. It appeared to originate from a stun gun. In the UK, this is a very unusual weapon. Could this help them find her killers? Detectives immediately faced one crucial question. Who would want Sadie Hartley dead? Nothing about the crime scene suggested a burglary or random attack. This must have been personal. They began with the basics, speaking to friends, colleagues, family, and of course, Ian, as is standard procedure in most homicide investigations. Ian was initially treated as a possible suspect, but his alibi checked out completely. He was in another country. That's when Ian brought up his affair with Sarah Williams and her insane obsession with him. He told officers about the anonymous letter, the stalking, the strange visitor a week prior. Suddenly, investigators had a motive, a suspect, and a reason to dig deeper. After looking into Sarah's profile, they quickly discovered her close friendship with Katrina Walsh. And the moment officers looked at surveillance footage around the village, everything moved rather quickly. Unfamiliar cars always stand out in a small village. When they spotted a light-colored Renault Clio passing near Sunnybank Road around the same time of the attack, officers grew curious. As detectives widened their search, even more surveillance footage was found. Cameras showed Sarah's black Volvo driving along Ian and Sadie's street at odd hours throughout December. On one recording, Sarah could even be seen crouching near Ian's car, retrieving what was later confirmed to be the tracking device she had planted there weeks earlier. Surveillance footage from a nearby Tesco store also showed Sarah and Katrina buying a cheap bouquet of flowers. The same night, Sadie received that suspicious gift at her front door. Piece by piece, police built an extraordinarily clear picture. In fact, the evidence was so obvious and abundant that within 1 week, Lancashire Police moved in to arrest them. Search warrants were obtained. In the early hours of January 20th, 2016, coordinated raids were carried out, ironically, due to a TV documentary crew following police that week. Sarah's arrest was even captured on film. How's that for coverage? Despite both Sarah and Katrina now being in custody, they both claimed to know nothing at all. But that story wouldn't last long. While searching Katrina's property, police found everything they needed. The 8-inch kitchen knife, the stun gun, the oversized boots, still smeared with Sadie's blood, and the obvious one, Katrina's diaries. What did I say about murderers and journals? By now, the case against these two was literally overwhelming. And here comes my favorite part. You know how much I love seeing accomplices turn on each other. That's precisely what happened here. Sarah claimed that on the night of the murder, she was actually at home and sick, meaning Katrina must have gone rogue without her consent or knowledge. Supposedly, it was to impress her. As for Katrina, her defense was even stranger. She told police she thought the entire thing was some kind of game show, like Hunted, where participants try to evade capture. Katrina even told officers she was scared Sarah would murder her next with prawns. In fairness, she is allergic to them, but still, it's weird. Safe to say, neither of their stories convinced anyone. Detectives had surveillance footage, forensic evidence, phone data, diary entries. All of it tied both of them to the murder. Game over. Eventually, while still in custody, Katrina agreed to show officers where she threw away the knife, stun gun, and all other evidence. All of the items were still exactly where she had left them. Bizarrely, it was all recorded by a TV crew. By summer of 2016, Sarah Williams and Katrina Walsh were formally charged with murder. Their so-called perfect crime had fallen apart so spectacularly that it was infamous throughout the country. Their trial ran for 7 long weeks. The jury was shocked as they experienced all the evidence available. Surveillance footage of Sarah and Katrina, the flowers, the murder weapon, the diary entries, even the photograph from the ski club Christmas party. When it was time for Ian to take the stand, it was obvious he was shaken and fragile. Not only was he forced to recall his affair with Sarah, he even had to read aloud multiple dirty text messages they'd exchanged. Quite humiliating for him, but also kind of his fault. At one stage, he broke down in tears, apologizing, saying he never imagined his foolish decisions could lead to something this terrible. He told the court he'd felt stalked, tried to cut contact long before the murder. However, Sarah's defense implied Ian had been leading her on. Sarah also testified that she in fact did not kill Sadie, that Katrina must have done it all on her own. But the prosecution ripped her theory apart. If that were true, why had she spent months tracking Sadie, buying flowers for her test run, traveling to Germany to purchase a stun gun? Katrina's defense was not much stronger. Her lawyers portrayed her as an eccentric older woman, a dreamer who had been manipulated by Sarah. While Katrina certainly was eccentric, her own diaries told a very different story. In the end, after 7 weeks of evidence and testimony, the jury took only 7 hours to decide. In August 2016, both Sarah Williams and Katrina Walsh were found guilty of murder. Sarah Williams was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for 30 years. Katrina Walsh received life without parole for 25 years. To this day, they are both thankfully behind bars. In the aftermath, the media dubbed Sarah a real-life bunny boiler, actually a nickname Katrina gave her in her own diary. Quite fitting. Sadie's son Harry told the court how his mother had been taken away far too soon, through no fault of her own. He described the massive void left behind in her absence. Ian himself has said he's been destroyed with guilt ever since. He has publicly apologized to Sadie's family, acknowledged that he opened the door to chaos. Ian should definitely feel shameful. But the truth is, he had no way of knowing this would end in murder. In interviews, he said, "Every day I question why I texted back." He wishes he had recognized the danger sooner. After the murder, Sadie's family asked Ian to move out of the property. He later discovered he was never named in her will. A painful but fair consequence. The murder of Sadie Hartley remains one of Britain's most disturbing modern cases. At its core, it's a deadly love triangle driven by obsession and cruelty. I don't think the quiet village of Helmshore has ever been the same. Neither has Sadie's family or children. Sadie lost her life simply because she loved someone. She was a devoted mother, a successful professional, a kind-hearted woman. Tragically, her life and all the work she was doing was lost at the hands of 2 evil creatures. Sarah and Katrina fancied themselves criminal masterminds. They thought they could plan the perfect murder. But they were pathetic, incompetent amateurs. Between Sarah's ego and Katrina's diary, they basically sent police an instruction manual for their own conviction. And I think there's something important in that, because this case is a perfect example of chaos theory. In reality, we have no way of controlling who comes into our lives. All we can really do is respect and treat everyone with kindness, and hope we get the same thing back. Sadie did exactly that. She forgave Ian. She chose love. She opened her door to a stranger. And 2 jealous, delusional women took everything from her. Those are my thoughts on this story. But what are yours? Do you think Sarah and Katrina received the sentences they deserved? Should Ian bear some responsibility for what happened? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching today. I really appreciate you being here. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me continue bringing you these important stories. And please, remember this: your safety matters. Trust your instincts. If someone makes you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, get help immediately. Set boundaries. Don't be afraid to say no. To everyone watching, take care of yourselves and each other. Stay safe and stay curious. Thank you and goodbye.